Hey guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. Now, in today's video, I'm going to run through Tudor Rebellions, and this is the second part in my series that I'm doing where I go through all of the main causes that you could be asked about, and I give you all the detail, all the evidence, all the information, and some summative conclusions about the role that these causes played in each rebellion. And I do it by cause. So previously I've done religion, go and check that one out if you haven't watched it. And in this one, I'm going to be talking about economic factors. So Henry VII. Now, two of Henry VII's rebellions have particularly strong economic causes. Now, first of all, the Yorkshire Rebellion, we can definitely say that economics were the primary factor in this rebellion. It was a rebellion really motivated by resentment over tax. Now, in my political video that follows, I'm going to give you a slightly more A-star way of analysing the link between money and political causes. So make sure when that one comes out next week, you do watch that as well for that slightly more analytical link. But at its root, it's absolutely an economic rebellion. Henry VII was given £100,000 by Parliament to support Brittany. This had to be raised by tax, and many saw this as unfair. A piece of evidence to show how resentful people really were is that actually only £27,000 was actually raised. Traditionally, the North paid taxes for the Scottish Wars and the South paid taxes for the French Wars. Therefore, Yorkshire really resented having to pay this money as it was to kind of aid Brittany and therefore make the French feel more isolated. That was the purpose of the money. So yeah, there was a geographical issue, geographical divide over Yorkshire feeling they had any reason to pay this tax. Finally, the counties of Northumberland, Westmoreland and Cumberland had been exempted by the king on account of poverty. There had been a really bad harvest. Yorkshire had also shared this harvest, but had not been exempted. So the poor harvest and the feeling of unfairness is what then exacerbated this reaction. Secondly, the second rebellion over tax under Henry VII is the Cornish Rebellion. Now, again, economics are one of the primary factors in the Cornish Rebellion. In this case, it was also coupled with the growing centralisation from government and the fact Cornwall was distinctly independent and autonomous. I'll go through those in the political video that follows. In terms of money, Parliament had voted £60,000 for a war against Scotland. So notice the similarity here. Yorkshire resented paying for France, therefore Cornwall resented paying for Scotland. Tin mining was also of great economic importance in the region, and Henry VII had suspended all original privileges that Cornwall had benefited from and introduced new centralised tin mining regulations. Something to notice about Cornwall is very patriotic, you could say, in its role of being an autonomous an autonomous region. It had its own government, had its own rules, and previous monarchs had given them these privileges. Henry VII came in and simply revoked those, which obviously caused some resentment from them at the time. Okay, Henry VIII also had rebellions over economics. So we're going to go through the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, I would argue the Pilgrimage of Grace has underlying and latent socio-economic issues that are of very significant relevance to the rebellion. Now, I think it would be hard to disagree that religion was the primary and most unifying factor. Go and watch the video on religion for all of those reasons. And I am going to add to this in the next video on politics and suggest there's a political marginalization from the upper classes. For the masses, item 14 of the Pontefract Articles requested to be discharged on the quinine and taxes now granted by Parliament. So there were taxation that the masses rejected. Inflation had led to grain prices rising by 2.9% by 1550. Ask referred to the impact that inflation was having on the land. If inflation had hit the north so much that monasteries needed to close, there should be no money nor treasure in those parts. So a suggestion that actually grain prices had increased and therefore that was impacting the poor. There was rioting in response to illegal enclosure. Over 300 people in Giggleswick in Yorkshire pulled down hedges, both areas sent rebels to the rebellion. So we're seeing the beginnings of those issues over enclosure that become a much more strong issue under Edward. And there's another complaint about rack renting, which was a practice where landlords raised the rents on the expiry of a lease. So when the lease, so what would happen is tenants would rent properties. However, there would really be no suggestion that they would leave. They would rent for the entirety of their life and then pass it to their son or their child, and that would continue. Now, what was happening was that these leases were expiring and the landlords were then exponentially raising the price of the rent. So families were either having to pay huge amounts more than they should have been, or they were finding they were turned out onto the street. Now, I've got a very specific example for you here of Henry Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland, who had risen his rents 8-fold. And then in general, another very specific fact, rents had increased 30% since 1548, and a number of landlords had revived old feudal dues. So there are loads of economic pressures on the poor, which were seen to be very unfair and not fair. Right. Edward. So Edward absolutely has rebellions based on economic factors. We know that there was the year of discontent where we have the 2 major rebellions under Edward, and that was primarily caused by a dissatisfaction really with the socio-economic conditions that were occurring in England. So we're going to start with the Western Rebellion. Now, arguably the Western Rebellion, also called the Prayer Book Rebellion, has very strong religious connotations. Go and watch the religious video to learn about those. But whilst it was primarily religious, there were a number of economic factors involved. Economic reasons were important and were partnered alongside these religious justifications. Notably, for example, there was a belief that local gentry were enriching themselves with church land. This shows us that those causes are interconnected. There's a way of reaching those A-star arguments. Can you suggest actually that it's not just this, it's a link between the two? And the reason that people were angry with the local gentry becoming richer and richer and richer ties into the fact of their religious dissatisfaction, but also that they are very unhappy with the state of economic affairs and the social hierarchy and the injustice surrounding that. So some evidence: a tax of 1d on sheep and ½ d on every pound of woolen cloth was introduced, and this tax hit poorer farmers and tenants as wealthy clothiers and sheep farmers raised their prices to offset its cost. Devon, as a largely enclosed area, was hard hit by this tax, and they are people who that's one of the areas that primarily sent rebels to the rebellion. And another piece of evidence to show there were class dissatisfaction: kill all gentlemen. They wanted to close the gap between rich and poor. Of all the Tudor rebellions, this is the one that I guess you could say criticised the social hierarchy the most. So the most social, well, I guess we often use the term socio-economic, but you could say that these causes kind of encompass those social reasons the most of any rebellion. Next, the Kett Rebellion. So the same year, Kett was primarily economic, caused by enclosure and growing wheat prices. Religion played a role and is also a connected factor, as there was resentment towards priests who enriched themselves through the property market. So we've got the same interconnected issue here, with priests or people who were within the church enriching themselves while the poor felt that religion wasn't being followed in the correct way, and that they weren't getting enough of this wealth themselves. Evidence: in their demands, it stated that no man should enclose anymore. 17 out of 29 demands were focused on enclosures, rents, and landlords. So that is well over 50%. So we can suggest, therefore, that it's definitely primarily an economic rebellion. It was sparked by allegations that landlords had been deliberately obstructing a government commission that was investigating illegal enclosure. Rebels believed they were trying to protect the law. They had turned to the law and it had let them down. So actually the rebels rushed to pull down these enclosures, believing they were protecting the law. And it was you need to go and look at what happens next, but it spirals out of control. Wheat prices had increased by 50% in 1548, and the 46 gentry held more than 60% of the land in Norfolk. They were also GPs, so ensured their interests were well served. So we've again got an issue here of injustice. The landlords are also the JPs, who are therefore making sure their interests are protected. Wheat prices are rising exponentially. The poor cannot afford it, and the gentry have over half of all the land in the area. All bondmen may be made free, which was one of the quotations, one of the demands, reference to tenants serving on the 40 manors belonging to the Howard family, where they paid high rents, inquisition fines, and wardship dues. So there is very specific evidence that there were economic reasons people were unhappy. Going into Mary, so the VIII Rebellion. Now, economic issues were not very important under Mary. Under Mary, huge economic reform takes place. And actually, while those issues only really become tangible under Elizabeth, because Elizabeth carries forward these economic reforms, it was actually under Mary that most of them are thought through. Now, that doesn't mean that Mary suddenly comes in and solves all these economic problems, but Mary doesn't rule for a very long period of time. She also signifies major religious change back to Catholicism. So actually what we can notice is that under Mary, rebellion wasn't necessarily really about economic factors. I'm going to go into Wyatt and Northumberland in the political video that follows, and show you that really those are politically motivated rebellions. However, money does play a role in motivating some of the lower classes to participate. Economic hardship also made people less tolerant of those other, I guess, more primary changes that took place. So we can talk about the decline of the textile industry in Kent and rising unemployment. Now, Elizabeth. Arguably, Elizabeth doesn't really have economically motivated rebellions. By the point of Elizabeth, the Tudor regime is very well established. Her religious changes are, on the whole, pretty much accepted by the people. And even when the Armada, for example, invades, English Catholics do not support Philip. Instead, they support the Queen. So by the point of Elizabeth, rebellion actually comes mostly from dissatisfied nobility who are feeling like they deserve more power, they're feeling marginalized, and they often used religion and other kind of factors to draw in support from the lower people involved. Now, what we can say under Elizabeth, and the reason I've said this is a little bit tenuous, but we can talk about Essex, because the Essex Rebellion, a very, very small rebellion, not particularly threatening, was primarily political. However, Essex was not a wealthy man, and he depended on Elizabeth to stay solvent. So it's partly his kind of desperate financial state that drives him to this rebellion. She has revoked his monopoly on sweet wines, so he finds himself pretty much without income, and that's kind of one of those things that pushes him over the edge into this rebellion. She's rescinded his monopoly on sweet wines, as I said. There we go. That is my summary on economic factors. Hopefully that's made it really, really clear for you, and stay tuned, because very shortly I'll be uploading a video on political factors, and then I have one final video with some really important, really helpful conclusions that you can use to really summarize all these ideas and all of your thoughts in order to write A-star essays.